Good evening, my name is Erin Macaulay and I'm the Equality Policy Officer at the STUC. I'm absolutely delighted to be welcoming you all this evening to our joint Equality Fringe event as part of our STUC 2020 Congress. We meet during a very challenging and uncertain time, where the future of our health, our economy, jobs and livelihoods are unknown. But what we do know is that the fight for equality and building a fairer society, ensuring workers' rights are protected, and joining a trade union has never been more important. In one of the wealthiest and most developed nations in the world, the level of inequality that persists in our communities, our workplaces, and our wider society is a symbol of shame. COVID-19 has affected each and every one of us, but the idea that we're all in the same boat, riding the same storm, could not be further from the truth. The past 7 to 8 months has exposed how unequal our society is. But as we'll hear tonight, inequality was already baked into our system long before COVID-19 came about. This evening's theme is Equality Now, the Fight Goes On. Our panel is made up of a representative from each of our equalities committees. They will all make a small contribution based on a key theme that predominantly affects their equality strand or protected characteristic. Once all of our panellists have contributed, we'll then move into a question and answer, and we would love for you to participate in this. To assist with the question and answer and discussion, I would strongly encourage you all to submit a question into the comment section. I can't promise that we'll get through every single question or topic, but I will certainly try my best to ensure that we have a great discussion about the future of equality in Scotland. I would like to remind our panellists, as difficult it might be, that they have no longer than 5 minutes. We could literally have a whole conference, as we usually do with all our equalities committees, dedicated to equality. So I know keeping to 5 minutes might be tough, but please stick to it. And before we kick off this evening, I would just like to emphasise to our panellists and anyone who's watching tonight to be mindful of your language, to be kind and to be respectful. A zero tolerance approach to bullying, harassment and discrimination is just as important online and during this digital setting as it is in person. Putting yourself out there to be part of a live panel and to talk in public is not always easy. For a few of our panel members, this is the first time that they've also done something like this. So whilst debate is healthy, it costs absolutely nothing to be kind and to be respectful, and that's all that we ask of our panel and our public tonight. I hope that you enjoy this evening. The fight for equality is substantial and it's a job for everyone. So beyond this Fringe event, please get active, get organised and utilise your voice and anger for change to ensure that equality is actually implemented on the ground. I would firstly like to introduce Tony Slavin from our Disabled Workers Committee to kick us off for this evening. Tony.
Thanks very much, Sharon. Colleagues, before we start, can I give you a few more facts about myself? Also, for unison shooter and employment law, health and safety, mental health. But more importantly, I jump about in powder blue suits and purple paisley pattern shirts because I used to wear black all the time, like Johnny Cash. I wore black because I couldn't find anything darker. So I'll let you just a wee insight into what it's like to be disabled. So I was at conference in Brighton and I was heading for the front of the stage. And then two gentlemen were speaking to the left-hand side of me and they were saying, "Oh no, it's that disabled guy. Oh, woe is me." And I thought to myself, is that how I project my disability? Nothing about the ingenuity and hard work that's got to get us here. Is that how I really project my disability? So, blue powder suits, purple shirts. Colleagues, I've got 3 statements to start with. This wee speech is aimed at addressing the shameful discrimination in employment against disabled people. It's an unarguable fact that disabled people are less likely to be employed than other workers. The employment gap is huge and it is scandalous. Number 3, a 20% gap is not a number, it's a symbol of opportunities that are lost, potential denied, and blighted lives because I've seen them. What is really needed to address the employment gap is a shift in employers' attitude. What is lacking is not so much employability on the part of the disabled people, but a willingness on the part of employers to employ more disabled people by providing inclusive workplaces and the support that goes with it. An article in the Independent reminds us that the 8th of November marked the 25th anniversary of the passing of the Disability Discrimination Act, the DDA 1995. This landmark Act made it unlawful to discriminate against disabled people in relation to employment, the provision of goods and services, education and transport for the very first time, although some protections were implemented in stages. And let's remember, discrimination against disabled people isn't just a scandal, it's against the law. We seem to live in an age of metrics, of key performance indicators, of quarterly reviews and monthly targets. This nonsense de-skills people. It takes away individual judgment and skill. But sometimes targets have their place and can be used for us and not against us. Current 2020 research by the Joseph Rowntree Foundation shows that nearly half of everyone living in poverty is either a disabled person or lives with a disabled person. That the disability employment gap is around 30%, and that disabled workers now earn a fifth, 20% less than non-disabled workers. Figures published in September by the Office of National Statistics show that disabled people and those living with long-term health conditions make up almost 6 in 10. That's 59% of all deaths involving COVID-19 in a period from March to July. Here's what we should be talking about. What if employers had to publish numbers of the disabled workers that they have even interviewed for jobs? What if they had to provide the numbers of disabled workers they appoint, the numbers of disabled people they promote? And finally, make it public how long they keep them in employment. Then, colleagues, we maybe see the employment gap is beginning to shorten. So let's look at the employers. New analysis published by the TUC shows that disabled workers now earn a fifth, that's 20% less than disabled workers. We said it before. It means that a pay gap, and I'm quoting directly now, for disabled workers has widened to £3,800 per year, an increase of over £800 over the last year. As this economic impact of COVID-19 kicks in, the gap will surely grow again. Disabled workers deserve more. We need mandatory disability pay gap reporting. We have waited long enough for fair and equal treatment at work. So sign the TUC petition and make the government bring in mandatory disability pay gap reporting for all employers who employ more than 50 employees. Disabled people are not overlooked. They are deliberately ignored. Colleagues, we want to see these measures being applied to every employer, but it places a special emphasis on public sector employees to start to monitor the disability employment gap properly. Their purpose is not driving shareholder value or a profit at all cost. They are there to provide services that we all need to sustain the public realm, to make society more livable for all of us. Colleagues, the Scottish Government has shown some interest in tackling the employment gap, and we welcome that. But interest isn't enough. We need to see some real ambition, and planning to take 20 years to halve the employment gap, that isn't ambition. They need to do better, and we need to be ensuring that they do. Let me tell you a few things about COVID and disabled workers. The STUC Disabled Workers Committee are leading a delegation to see Michael Matheson, the Transport Minister, next week. So imagine Glasgow Central Station. We'll be asking questions like, how do you social distance when you're blind? If you're deaf and you rely on facial expression or you lip read, how do you communicate if everybody is jumping about with face masks on? What if you have mobility problems or learning difficulties? Do you see what I mean? If COVID is hard for workers, and it is, double it, treble it, and then you can start to imagine how difficult it is for a disabled worker. Ian Hamilton, the BBC roving reporter, who's been blind since birth and is now in his 60s, has said, I have never felt so blind as I do now during the coronavirus. That said, colleagues, we can't just demand action from government. We need to act ourselves, and we need to tackle the employment gap as part of our bargaining agenda. We need to move. Colleagues, I'm sure we've all known someone who gives us a spark, someone who fans the flames of fight in our bellies. Sadly, I lost someone like that to COVID. He was an old-fashioned short steward. You know the type, everything written in longhand, and he had a memory like an elephant. We must remember this. The people who are a spark, who give us the flames of fight in our bellies, sometimes they don't get to sit around the fire. So it's up to us. Colleagues, disabled workers are workers, and we have a right to dignity. We have a right to respect, but most importantly, we have a right to work. The fight goes on. Thanks for listening.
Thanks very much, Tony, for that excellent contribution. Thank you once again, Tony, for that excellent contribution. I would also just like to highlight to everyone that is watching and to our panellists that this month is Disability History Awareness Month. We will be hosting a Disability History Month webinar on Thursday, the 3rd of December at 6 p.m. So if you following Tony's contribution, if you want to come and listen, then we would absolutely love you to come along. Next up, we have Maria Feeney from our Young Workers Committee. Once you're ready, Maria, as I said, can you please keep it to 5 minutes if possible? Look forward to your contribution.
Hi everyone, it's a pleasure to be here today, tonight even, especially during those times that we're in. I'm here on behalf of the STUC Young Workers Committee, and I'm going to talk about some of the struggles we face as not technically an equality sense, but as we do with other equality committees. But yeah, so young people, it's undoubtedly that this year has been a horrendous year for so many workers. And what I do want to discuss tonight and recognise is that young workers aren't exempt from that, and if so, have faced some difficult hardships, and that's in terms of their workers' rights. So young workers are more likely to be in 0-hour contracts, and if they're lucky enough, they could be more lucky, they could possibly be in short fixed-term contracts, and that is the reality of the workforce today. Young workers are predominantly in these insecure contracts that offer no support and offer no security. Again, with this, and they overcome that and they manage to get a secure contract, young workers are often faced with the difficulty of being first to let go, as they are more likely to be in this insecure, precarious work. It's been reported that a third of young people in Scotland will be unemployed by December. Now that is fast approaching, and it's very sad, and a lot of this is down to the fact that young workers have been on these 0-hour contracts in which they are unable to have their employment rights that would be granted to workers on more permanent contracts. Now, that's a difficulty. Now, when that difficulty is overcome, young people are then often faced with wage disparities within their workplace, where their older counterparts are getting paid a higher wage than someone their age for doing the exact same job. So again, it's another level of discrimination that's been put on top of that. And this kind of applies especially for apprentices who are paid despicable wages for work. And not only that, we have seen, especially this year, it needs to be recognised that young people who are studying, such as paramedics, nurses and teachers, who go on these placements and basically do the work, are not getting paid. And it's shocking that a young worker is treated like this. And furthermore, due to COVID, a lot of the industries young workers are in are being massively affected, such as the hospitality and events industry, where young people dominate this and they don't have secure contracts to fall back on for safety. Going on top of that, young workers are faced with the insecurity of not being entitled to their housing benefit part of benefits, or the insecure of finding secure tenancies or homes. They don't have the security to save up for mortgages due to these issues such as 0-hour contracts and age wage disparities. So they're relying on landlords who are exploiting them for profit and so often despicable housing conditions. And for that, it's a cycle of precarious living from 0-hour contracts, wage age disparities, unpaid placement, unpaid internships, and secure housing. And it's a shame because there is no wonder there's a mental health crisis within the youth today. I found this fact out tonight that was quite shocking, that 1 in 9 young people in Scotland have attempted suicide. And when working conditions and living conditions are so despicable and offer no security, it is, again, like I said, no wonder this is the case. So tonight will be good to get a discussion going. If anybody's got any questions, to know what it's like as a young worker and the experience that we have, and as well across young workers who fall into other equality categories. This will be a good discussion. It's clear that the fight goes on, and the government really now needs to stand up now more than ever due to COVID and stand up for the voices of young workers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maria. And specifically for mentioning young people's mental health, I think it's fair to say that there is an epidemic in Scotland for young people's mental health, and that provision, funding and support has to be put in place. Awareness is absolutely vital and important, but to leave particularly young people on waiting lists for months and months and months is unacceptable, and something that the STUC is fighting to. We're fighting for better funding, for support in place, in addition to awareness. So thank you very much for raising that. I'd now like to move on to our third speaker of this evening, Usman Ali from the STC Black Workers Committee. Usman, like everyone else, if you can keep it to 5 minutes, that'd be absolutely fantastic.
Good evening, Scotland, and thank you very much for that introduction, Erin. The STC Black Workers Committee has been working very hard this year on things that really matter to Scotland's Black and ethnic minority workers and communities. 2020 has seen a lot of things happen, often strange. A coronavirus pandemic, Black Lives Matter, and a rise in hate, which we must all do to challenge. However, the STC Black Workers Committee, I was just 3 years old when that committee was created and its first conference held. It's quite hard sometimes to think that, things like the coronavirus and Black Lives Matter has brought things to the fore. But actually, that committee has been up and running for almost a quarter of a century and has been taking the fight for race equality head on here in Scotland and abroad. And one thing I wanted to do when I took office as chair a year ago was pay tribute to all those that served on the committee before me and in the chair before me, but also commit myself to stop being the chair that does a lot of talking and instead be a chair in a committee that does a lot of doing. So what have we been doing? Well, with coronavirus, we have challenged the Scottish Government time and time again, and we have won. So on data, when Scotland started behind other parts of the United Kingdom in terms of the data it held for BAME people either accessing health and social care or working in health and social care, we challenged the Scottish Government to act, and they did, and that is now why Scotland is ahead of others across the United Kingdom. We also asked the Scottish Government to improve the risk assessments being carried out where BAME people are working, particularly on those kind of frontline key worker roles. And we've also been behind our fight to carry on tackling racism, not just when it happens abroad, like with George Floyd in America, but here at home with the Sheikh Obayo case. Sheikh Obayo, who died and an altercation with the police 5 years ago, and 5 years on, his family is still waiting for justice. And we have also responded internally as STUC and as a Black Workers Committee to having to make sure that we respond appropriately. This is why we are still doing the St. Andrew's Day, the annual march and rally that we do every year, but we've responded to make it appropriate and do it virtually this year. And I invite all of you to join us on the morning of the 28th of November to show solidarity. This month is also Islamophobia Awareness Month. And one of the things that STUC Black Workers Committee has done is develop a strategy in consultation with key stakeholders within our movement, but also out with, involving the Muslim community of Scotland as well, to make sure that the trade union movement in Scotland, once and for all, has a strategy to deal with and stamp out Islamophobia. You may also know that the STUC Black Workers Committee has been leading a campaign called Break the Race Ceiling. The Break the Race Ceiling campaign is targeted firstly at public sector employers. We have sent a letter to 150 public sector employers to ask them for data and information about how many BAME people they employ, but also how they understand, recruit, retain, and help progress people from a BAME background within their organisation. This leads me to the factor of institutional racism. I'm heartened that this week the Scottish Parliament's Equality and Human Rights Committee has published a report on race equality and employment. Just this afternoon, I was reading through that report, and there was one recommendation in particular that stood out for me, and that was around leadership. It says the committee recommends that chief executives show leadership in tackling institutional racism. I would like to add that I think we need to do something much more than that. We need to firstly understand what is going on and what is already being applied, and understand what actually needs to be improved and how we can do that. And that's why we need to apply the understand first, act second approach, where we stop acting in terms of tokenistic gestures, but we actually understand the people and the things and the processes and the systems that we're trying to influence. And that way we can make meaningful action and break that race ceiling once for all. Race equality is now. The fight does go on, but it is a fight that we all must win. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Usman, for that great contribution. I will move to our next speaker from the STUC Women's Committee, Davina. Just when you're ready.
Thank you very much. As Erin said, my name is Davina Rankin and I'm representing the STUC Women's Committee tonight. Just firstly, a thank you to the organisers and for everyone showing up for tonight's Fringe, which is a really important event for us. When we started planning this Fringe way back, it was very much a pre-COVID era. And even when the STUC made the decision that we'd be holding this online today, I don't think we really thought that 8 months after we entered lockdown, we'd now have tiers, fire breaks and lockdowns across different parts of the UK. Our contribution was to be around the gender pay gap and the fact that it hasn't changed despite 50 years of legislation. Now I want to conclude my remarks by looking at that, but I did want to start by talking about the impact COVID-19 has had on women, both in their working and home lives. And the differential impact is in itself an eloquent way of highlighting why there is still a gender pay gap and systemic discrimination in the UK. When the pandemic first struck, the nation discovered a newfound level of respect for those that they were deemed as essential workers. Shop workers, cleaners, bus drivers, care assistants, factory workers, all had a light shone in the work they do day in and day out to keep us going as a nation. Clap for carers on a Thursday was a nation's way to choose how they chose to show respect for these workers. However, a majority of these roles are carried out by women, and more often than not, they are low-paid roles, many earning them the rebanded national minimum wage, highlighting the fact that the jobs carried out predominantly by women still are chronically undervalued. When governments across the UK were asked to put their hands in their pockets to replace the clapping with a decent wage, the silence was deafening. Another issue that came out really early into the pandemic was a lack of appropriate PPE. In private care homes, profit had been put before people, and staff were asked to either go without or use whatever they could find. And there are ongoing reports of care assistants using bin bags instead of aprons, or simply having no PPE, and that's putting them at increased risk. Staff were threatened with not being paid if they were to self-isolate because they had been identified as having close contact with someone who had tested positive for COVID-19. And without a strong response from the trade unions, that would have continued. However, we are still seeing reports of staff facing the choice of either reporting for work after being told to self-isolate or not getting paid. And it is still taking a strong trade union response to make sure these women get paid. For those staff that could work from home, we saw women trying to balance full-time work and homeschooling or other caring responsibilities, because despite it being 2020, the majority of care is still provided by women. Now that the schools are open again, we see women being forced to stay at home as their children are sent home to self-isolate. And where they have more than one child, they could become stuck in a cycle of having to take repeat periods of time off and being faced with the choice of either unpaid leave or using up their annual leave. I know a lot of women who have got more than one child, and what they see is just this one ends its period of self-isolation, they are forced to take a second period because their second child is sent home. But one positive that has come out of the pandemic is the spread of flexible working, whether that's the ability to work condensed hours or even new shifts being introduced in factories, or the ability to work from home beyond what would be considered normal 9 to 5. This is something we really need to fight to keep, so that we can make a difference to the women in the workplace and actually start to tackle the gender pay gap. I mean, I did mention in my opening comments about the gender pay gap. It has slowed down the closing of that gap. What we're seeing is we can still be fighting this in potentially 100 years' time, and we will still have a gender pay gap. And that is despite the fact we've had legislation for 50 years. The fundamental issue is the chronic undervaluing of women's work, what is deemed as women's work. And until we radically change how we pay and respect those who carry out those jobs, the gender pay gap will never disappear. I work in higher education, and we've done a lot of modelling, but we know if we paid our cleaners more, we would cut our gender pay gap by a significant amount. We need to change how we view caring responsibilities and invest in it, because we know it makes a massive difference to our economy as a whole if we respect and pay carers properly. The gender pay gap is going to take a lot of time and effort. Legislation doesn't change anything. A changing culture will. And I think what we've seen during this pandemic is those jobs we rely on the most, whether it's those who work in the shops where we go and get our food, or those who look after our relatives as care assistants and kept our nations going, are always the ones that are chronically underpaid and predominantly done by women. So just some food for thought, and I look forward to the discussion as we go forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Davina, for that insightful contribution, and I'm sure there'll be some questions around that. We are moving on to our final speaker, and we will be moving on to hopefully a really good discussion. So I would encourage you all, if you could submit some questions based on what you've heard so far, or something more broadly that you can be put to the panel, I would please encourage you all to submit a question. So I would like to move to our final speaker, who is from our LGBT Workers Committee. Thomas, once you're ready, take it away.
Thanks, Sarah. Solidarity from myself and all of Glasgow Trades Council to all fellow workers tonight and at Congress over the next week. So my name's Tom Queen. I use they, them pronouns. I'm the branch secretary of Unite at Glasgow University and hold the Trades Council seat on the STUC LGBT+ Workers Committee. So I'm here tonight to touch on some of the issues that have affected LGBT plus and queer workers throughout COVID, and to reach out to comrades to consider how to fight these. Firstly, a major element within the LGBT community is that of chosen family. Now, some are lucky to have support from their birth family, many others are not. And community is a major aspect of queer lives. The inability for people to move house during the pandemic, for example, left many in precarious and dangerous housing situations. For workers who could not be out, this meant additional stress, potential danger as well if they were in difficult home situations. But community is not just the home you live in. One's chosen family may be very widely geographically spread, or people seen particularly primarily in community spaces. Apologies for the boy racers outside. COVID has brought about the closure of cafes, bookshops, and in particular, clubs, bars, and arts and performance spaces, which host events specifically catered to and run by LGBT workers. What may seem like a simple night out to some can be a lifeline for some people embedded within the community or new to it, be that being new to the city or town you're in, or new to embracing or trying to learn how to embrace your identity. And I speak here as somebody who's run a queer club night for a number of years. It has been painfully isolating not seeing these faces every month. The arts and hospitality sectors are ones in which a lot of queer workers are embedded, and both have frankly been left to rot by governments, with unions such as Unite, Hospitality, Prospect, and others left to pick up the pieces. And though these sectors can be a more safe environment for those of us who perhaps present in different manners that don't necessarily respect so-called traditional gender norms, it should be noted that whatever sector we work in, our presentation opens us up disproportionately to abuse, as well as difficulties in seeking progression. Now, many of those who are in employment tend to be in lower paid and public facing roles where exposure to COVID is higher and trade union density and recognition are lower. And that's if workers can pass well enough to get employment in the first place, as both overt and unconscious biases are evident in the structures of employment. And the fear of both seeking and maintaining employment is bad enough without the major precarity that's brought about by COVID. So with the existing social prejudices against LGBT workers, added to the stress that's naturally come along since the pandemic started, this created a perfect storm of mental health implications. And access to healthcare remains a further barrier here. The effects of many diseases are all the more damaging to those suffering from mental ill health, and COVID is no exception there. Indeed, with the ever-growing cases of so-called long COVID showing potential long-term, if not permanent, reduced function, I really fear what this will mean for our fellow workers. And when it comes to healthcare, we again face structural problems. Many of us in the LGBT community will know people, or unfortunately sometimes have first-hand experience of having lost hope in aspects of the healthcare system, be that from years of slashed mental health services, reaching out only to be met with a lack of understanding, disdain, dismissal, or simply go do some yoga. Mental health care is laden with barriers against those who can't afford private therapy, or trans workers who face years on waiting lists and political voices across the spectrum wanting to rip away even that small hope of life-saving affirmative care. So to finish up, when these workers face the stresses of COVID, both mental and physical, and feel they cannot get help, who must they turn to? One another, and that means us too within the movement. When our communities are shut down, we organise for government support until workers are paid. When employers are homophobic, we organise against them until they change their ways. When co-workers are transphobic, we organise for justice, lifting up the most marginalised in solidarity. And when our healthcare system's lacking, we organise support groups, recommend safe therapists, fundraise to deal with the immediate problems whilst fighting against systemic barriers. What we do not and will not do and must not do is ask nicely for oppressors to stop. We are many, they are few. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Thomas. And before we move into our question and answer, just to remind people to submit some questions. Although we don't specifically have a speaker for older workers, I would also just like to emphasise that older workers are an area of concern for us as well, and that we should recognise inequalities that older workers in particular face, and we should never ever let them divide us. So solidarity as well to all older workers and some of the key challenges that older people in particular are facing at this time. I would now like to move to our question and answer session, and hopefully we have a good discussion. I'd just like to remind people, both in our comments and the panellists, just to be mindful of your language and be respectful. So without further ado, I would like to move into our first question of this evening once everybody comes back on the screen. All right, is everybody good for a question then? Great. Okay, so to kick us off this evening, and a few people have touched on some of these pieces of legislation, but to kick off, and this is a question for everyone, it's been 50 years since the Equal Pay Act, 20 years since the Race Relations Act, 25 years this year since the Disability Discrimination Act, and 10 years since the passing of the Equality Act in the UK. So within this year, there's been a lot of anniversaries in terms of equality policy and legislation. However, what difference, firstly, in fact, how important have these pieces of legislation been? And what difference or how effective have these pieces of legislation been, in your opinion? Do you think they've been effective? Have they made the difference on the ground? If not, what more has to be done? So I'll go to Usman first. That's all right.
I guess I should explain as well. My notes during the beginning of my introduction got a bit muddled, but I think in answer to your question, one of the early things I wanted to point out was, our committees that we all represent here, the STUC Black Workers Committee, which I'm representing tonight, has been long, have existed long before things like coronavirus and Black Lives Matter have happened, and they'll be here long after. And I guess in the same spirit, the legislation, so 20 years since Race Relations Act came into being, that is just 5-6 years before that the STUC Black Workers Committee came into being. And I'd like to think, as a result of all those people at that time did the campaigning, which obviously the then Labour government obviously took action to introduce that specific piece of legislation. But in terms of legislation in itself, it cannot ever be the only answer, the only solution in the room. I think public accountability also has a big part to play. We're certainly seeing that with things like the Break the Rate Ceiling campaign, where we have gone and called out these public sector employers. And by the way, we're not just stopping at public sector, we will come to the private and third sectors as well in due course. But in terms of the public sector, when we are actually asking them for information and we're bringing that out into the public eye, that is the stuff that's really making a difference. There is, recording and reporting is important, but it can only do so much. It's the accountability alongside action, which is going to really make the real meaningful differences that workers and communities actually need.
Okay, thank you very much, Usman. I'll go to Davina. I know you touched on this around the equal pay. So how important is legislation? Has it made a difference in your opinion?
I think it is really important. I know I did rubbish it because the gender pay gap is still so large, but if you can go back to the 70s and sort of the barriers women faced in the workplace, I was talking pre-COVID to one of our receptionists. She worked in the airline industry as an air steward back in the day, and she was forced out of her job when she got pregnant. So, it was the case if you got pregnant, you had to go home and you weren't allowed to work. She was sacked, and that was perfectly legal when that happened. And so things have changed, they have progressed, but we seem to have stalled. It's as if the politicians feel, well, we've got that piece of legislation, we've done our job, time to move on. And that's not the case. And just to pick up on what Usman said, it's not just about reporting, it's not just about legislation. I would like to see it go much further. It's about enforcement, and there has to be penalties behind not actually eradicating the pay gaps. And we're already starting to talk about how you can tackle the disability pay gap, the ethnic pay gap, and I think there has to be there has to be a recognition that there's intersectionality in play. you know, I'm a woman, but I'm also a black woman, so I'm impacted in two different strands. So I would love to see it to be enforced properly, a watchdog with real teeth, proper fines in place for companies who continue and have a persistent pay gap. Because if you look at the gender pay reporting requirements, all you have to do is publish a plan. All you have to do is publish your gap. It's you don't have to justify why it's so big. You don't have to take action. And I've seen some of the pay gaps in universities. One who sits with an award for their commitment to gender equality, and the principal, a female, justified the gender pay gap at their university by saying, well, women are cleaners, that's just these things, that's a societal thing. So legislation has helped, but we need to go to the next step. Companies will not do this unless it's in their interest to tackle discrimination, and if that means you fine them or you cut their funding, it has to be done, because I won't live long enough to see the end of the gender pay gap in the current trajectory. In fact, nobody in this call will live long enough to see the end of the gender pay gap the way we're going. So it's time to get serious and start to fine.
Thank you very much, Davina. That was a fantastic answer, and I'm sure many of the panel would agree with that as well. I'll go to Thomas. In your opinion, in terms of legislation, just on the back of Davina there.
Yeah, I mean, what answer to follow up? I think I've got quite mixed feelings on the question there. So on the one hand, the Equality Act is one of the most powerful pieces of legislation that we have as trade unionists. And honestly, any rep, any member should go out there and learn about it, because I cannot count the amount of cases that it's helped us win. Where I am a little bit more, I guess, cynical about legislation is that the trade union movement isn't, the law isn't the be-all and end-all of how we operate here. Bearing in mind how the governments have tried to clamp down on trade unions and organising, they could just as easily repeal acts of equality when it's politically expedient for them to do so. So I think one of the questions we need to be asking as a movement isn't so much how can we use what we've got. It's more about as well, how can we make sure it doesn't go back? We need to make sure that we actually keep the victories that we've been fighting for, and not fall into the, I guess, kind of liberal trap of thinking that just because something is illegal or conversely no longer illegal, that somehow we've won. That because same-sex marriages can happen, suddenly homophobia is gone now. It no longer exists, right? That's not how it works. We can't make an unfair system fair simply by co-opting previously marginalized groups into it, because what we have to remember is that system oppressed all of us for so long. The structures that could cause us to be oppressed again are still there. I realize that's quite a roundabout way of looking at it, but that's where I am with that.
Okay, no, that's a great insight, Thomas. Thank you very much for that. And there's lots of people that are coming in and commenting saying that there's a lot of awareness needed to utilise this legislation, but in addition to the legislation, that employers have to be held accountable. People are agreeing with the penalties. So there's obviously a lot. The scale of inequalities, as we've recognised tonight, the legislation has obviously been really important, but there's a lot of work that we still have to do. I'll go to Maria very quickly, then Tony. So Tony, if you just want to come in straight after Maria, and we'll move to the next question.
Yeah, kind of agreeing with everyone's points. It's undoubtedly that we as trade unionists stand on the shoulders of giants who helped fight for this legislation, especially in a workplace perspective. However, I think it's clear we wouldn't be here today if the legislation solved all inequalities within our society. So it is a difficult one, and it's sad that it hasn't been the be all and end all to solve inequality. And I think the reason for that is that from a young worker's perspective, that organisation in workplaces lack accountability, and that they are getting away with breaking rules on legislation and not upholding equality, maybe when in subtle ways, where it's a male-dominated hierarchical staff, or that's white and able-bodied and straight, that we often find. And it's that way where Davina says it is intersectionality that we do need to discuss as well. Reiterating what Usman said, it's important that these companies and workplaces, it's great that they produce these reports on their gender pay or their equality when it comes to BAME workers or able-bodied workers or young workers and LGBT workers. However, until they talk the talk rather than just until they walk the talk rather than just talk the talk, that means nothing. These reports mean nothing. And frankly, it's insulting when we see these big companies promoting these equality, equal reports and all this work they do, when actually their staff are being discriminated against, be it in subtle ways, be it in wage gaps, be it in the off the mark comments that shouldn't be acceptable, be it in bosses who with making sexual advances on women in the workplace. It's clear that legislation hasn't solved these issues, and it's like Davina mentioned. I know we've been fighting for this for so long, but it is now time to get serious and start. It doesn't matter how subtle these attacks on inequality, acts of inequality are, we need to be challenging it every single step of the way, no matter how subtle it is.
Thank you very much. Tony, if you just try and make your conclusion brief so we can move to the next question, that'd be great.
Okay, I will. I agree. I mean, that's great what Maria's just said there. I said during my contribution that disabled people are not overlooked, they are deliberately ignored. You could put any of their protected characteristics in there, any of their quality strands, and they are. They're being deliberately ignored, they're being hidden, and that is why we need to have mandatory publications of who companies are employing, who they're promoting, what they're doing, how long people with protected characteristics are lasting in employment. We need the ammunition. The legislation's okay as far as it goes, but we need the ammunition to take to the legislation in order that we can get things done. So we are not being overlooked, we're being deliberately ignored.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for that interesting debate. We could have a whole conference to that question, and you know, maybe it's an idea for a future conference. But I'm going to move on to the next question, which is kind of following on from this, from Jenny Douglas. And Jenny has asked what the panel's views are in relation to what we can do as a trade union movement to refresh the campaign to get union equality reps fully recognised, to give them full recognition in terms of their rights. So we know at the moment that equality reps don't get facility time, and I suppose that, you know, that poses major barriers and major challenges for people who are taking on these roles, that, you know, they're maybe not given that time to go and fight these equality battles. So what is the panel's view on that? I'll go to Thomas first. I know that you said that in your previous contribution that you know, you've used the Equality Act in a lot of your workplace in a kind of industrial setting. So what's your view on recognition for equality reps, and what more do we need to do?
It's something that is a particularly pressing question right now, as we are at my workplace renegotiating our recognition agreement, and the one change that I have specifically said needs to go into it, I believe the other unions are behind me on this, is that equality reps should be considered as integral to the movement as a health and safety rep, as a shop steward, as a ULR, sorry, as a union learning rep. The work that we do as equality reps is frankly quite understated. Like, it's underestimated the amount that we have to contribute. So be that in workplace policy things, or even just casework with individual members, a knowledge of how to use the Equality Act effectively to look at things like, you know, if there's a restructuring going on, are the people whose jobs are maybe being made redundant or happen to be, as they were in one case in a previous thing I had to deal with, all women in one area. We were able to save employment through that. It's just so important to have the time to actually sit and go through casework with a fine-tooth comb from an equalities perspective, and you need the facility time to do that. So that's absolutely something we need to be fighting for.
Okay, excellent, thank you very much. Tori, I'm going to bring you on in this if you've got an opinion on it.
Equality reps are fantastic. They absolutely are essential for keeping stewards on the sort of straight and narrow, and their advice is always great because they steep themselves in legislation, which is absolutely fantastic, and that's what we need. I would just like to get equality reps to take a wee further step forward to become full-time reps, and then the idea of facility time is then wiped away. That's all I've got to say on it.
Has anyone else in the panel got a view on this? Maria?
Hi, yeah, I wouldn't mind coming in. So technically I understand youth isn't one of, like I mentioned in my first part, protected characteristic, and understand that, but I still am quite passionate about this. I know the STUC are currently looking at ways to do this, and more will be coming out about that. But I think, like I previously mentioned, a lot of workplaces aren't being held accountable through their achievements or through their the inequality within workplaces. And this, I mean, I think we all agree here, it's so important that this, having a equality rep that has facility time, that would be one major way in which we can challenge that and fight inequality within workplaces. But I also want to mention, from a young worker's perspective, that I often think gets overlooked, and it's maybe going off a little, but young people, like I've mentioned, and like you'll have heard all before, they're more likely to be in 0-hour contracts, they're more likely to be in temporary contracts, or they're more likely to be in short-term fixed-term contracts. Not only that, they don't seem to have normal working patterns of 9 to 5, and you're continually working with different types of people within your workplace, so you're not building up that relationship with your fellow workers, because you maybe won't see them for a few days, a few weeks on each shift. And I think young workers are overlooked in that. We're not young worker dominated workplaces aren't unionised, and it's very, very difficult to even have a rep, never mind an inequality rep within these places. And I think it's definitely overlooked by not within our movement, and it's something that we should be striving for, to unionise in precarious workplaces, so that not only I mean, equality rep is just so off from, as a young worker, to imagine for myself, like so to have a rep would be incredible. And I just think it's something that we need to always have in the back of our minds, that when you go to your meetings and there's not a lot of young people there, it's because they won't be getting facility time, and it's difficult.
Thank you very much for that point. And you know, there's some comments coming in about, you know, mentoring, and I think it's really important that to recognise that for many young people coming through our movement, they've perhaps not came in a traditional way. They've perhaps not came in where they've got the bread and butter of the industrial trade union. So I think bridging that gap between some of our more experienced trade unionists who've got the bread and butter industrial, and blending that with a lot younger activists and trade unionists that are coming in the movement, and perhaps being activists within the union, but not necessarily getting the experience of being a rep or representing somebody, is definitely something that we need to do more around and bridge that gap between our younger workers and activists who are coming in with no bread and butter experience of representing someone, and the experience, the wealth of experience that we have with our retired members. I think mentoring and guiding is really, really important. So thanks for raising that, Maria. I'd also just like to take this opportunity to pitch the Equality Rep network that we have. So we've got an Equality Rep network. So if you are a rep, an Equality Rep in your workplace at the moment, the STUC does have an Equality Rep network. And I can put my email and my colleague's email, Ewan, who runs that, in the chat if you'd like to join. We're also forming an Equality Officers and Policy Forum as well. So if you're an official in a union that deals with equality, then we'd love you to join that forum as well. I'm going to move to our next question. There's been a few on mental health. I know, Maria, you mentioned young people's mental health. Thomas, I know you focused on mental health as well. It's an issue that fundamentally affects us all. You know, we might not all have experienced a mental health issue or illness, but each and every single person has mental health. So, what, firstly, can we do as trade unions and as a movement? Because there's been lots and lots of motions over the past years from all equality strands and at the STUC itself on awareness raising and really putting mental health, trying to strive for parity with mental health and physical health. But what more could we do as a trade union for workers' mental health? And what actions do you think that employers and governments need to do around workers' mental health? So I will go to Usman first, and then I will bring whoever has a strong kind of opinion on this. So I'll go to Usman first.
Thanks very much, Erin. I guess there's kind of three things that need to be done in relation to that question on mental health. First thing is, and I speak predominantly from a Black minority ethnic perspective here, although I do know there's a degree of intersectionality because men.
Well, I think we've lost Usman. I haven't cut him off, I promise.
Sorry,
Usman, I didn't cut you off, honestly.
No. I don't know what happened there. My screen just went blank. Sorry. But I'm saying there, the degree of intersectionality, because mental health is something that impacts us all. So, firstly, is the stigma that is still far too often for many groups in society out there. You know, it's mental health, as I say, impacts us all. We all need to have good mental health. Where we struggle, we need support, and it's okay to not be okay, and it's okay to ask for that support. That brings me on to understanding. I think, you know, government needs to understand better in terms of the needs of many of the underrepresented groups in particular, but groups such as those from a Black minority ethnic background also need to understand, and family networks as well, all need to understand, particularly, you know, mental health of young people, for example, that Maria was talking about. And lastly, then it's around support, and that's not just making sure that we have adequate support services out there, that they're being invested in, they're properly resourced, but that we're looking to, particularly with coronavirus, you know, has presented even greater mental health problems, and therefore the solutions also need to be to match that need. And so we do need to recruit more, you know, counsellors. We need to put some financial support for people looking to do, you know, to train as counsellors and therapists. We need to create a specific fund for them. I've been speaking to some people who are going through some initial training from a BAME background, but need £7,000 each to do their diploma to be able to fully qualify. So there is, those barriers in terms of financial implications. People are losing their jobs, looking to retrain. So there's a lot of opportunities there, and these are things that we need to do, practical things that we need to do to get things going.
Thanks very much, Usman. I'll go to Tony and then Davina, if that's all right.
Thanks, Erin. We have to be slightly careful here. I mean, the union that I'm in, Unison, we do a lot of mental health awareness courses. We do mental health awareness training. What we haven't stepped into is a mental health first aider. We're still looking at that because we're a wee bit concerned that if you give mental health awareness training, that's fine. You're able to signpost somebody, and that's absolutely fantastic. If you're a mental health first aider, then you're sort of verging on to doing a wee bit more than that, practitioner sort of stuff, and it's something you need to be very careful of. And they describe them as they change the title and they say mental health champions and everything. A dead quick example: if you've got a cut finger and you're a first aider and your pal comes to you, somebody comes to you, oh, I've cut my finger, you've got a plaster on it, away they go, that's fine. If somebody has a mental health problem and they give you a call and you signpost them successfully and they get fixed, 2 months down the line, the same thing happens at 3 o'clock in the morning, who's the first person they're going to call? They're going to call you. So there has to be some, we need to watch that we're not turning into practitioners rather than signposters, and there's a lot of mental health awareness courses that are kicking about that would start us off down the line of trying to get help for people with poor mental health.
Okay, brilliant. Thanks very much, Tony. Davina?
Yeah, I'm going to be really brief because I don't want to repeat what has already been said. I think there's some key points we could do. I work in a university, and I know for our students, when they move to a different location, they quite lose that support they had. So if they'd been under a counsellor in their hometown and they move to the university town, they then go back to the bottom of a waiting list, which can make the situation worse. So we have to have massive investment in our mental health care. This is Cinderella branch of the National Health Service. It needs massive investment, and we do need to train and make it easier to access. Employers have to make it easier. It might be an option they put for their occupational health. I know at my work, if I wanted to phone up, I could get a one-to-one counselling via the telephone, and that's not reported. I think employers need to make that more available because we know work-related stress can lead to personal life stress as well, so employers can step in. The one thing I would add that nobody's mentioned before is the support we need to give trade union reps. Even if they're not mental health first aiders, they're under a lot of stress supporting members and day in, day out. And I know a lot of reps who have really been stressed because we either dealt with members who have felt suicidal because they're going through a disciplinary or there's serious health issues in the background. So I think we need to look at, as a trade union movement, what more we can do to help our own, because at the end of the day, these people are dealing with complex cases on a regular basis, and if we can't support our own, we're not going to be in a position to support our members. So those are the kind of points. But I do believe it's something we need to do more, and the biggest thing, like most things, is funding. Without proper funding, we'll never tackle this issue.
Thank you very much, Davina, for that, and I think it's a great point that you raise around really ensuring that we do have support infrastructures for our own reps as well. Does anyone else have any comments or reflections on this question? Maria, did you put your hands up there? Yep, okay.
Yeah, just a couple of points. Obviously in agreement and echoing what Tony says about where the union's position is on this, because it should be the responsibility of all parties when protecting workers. I think though what we do need to recognise is the current climate of work is not fit for the human, it's just not a fit way of living, it's not a healthy way of living, and I think the trade unions are doing and should continue to campaign and educate that this can change. It doesn't need to be like this, and that again helps just to know that it's all right to feel a bit of stress when you're working precarious hours and your wages are low, because it shouldn't be like this, and that's where the issues lie. In terms of employers, like I think someone mentioned, mental health as well should be treated as like any physical illness that workers have, and there should be less of a stigma around that within the workplace. But not only that, right now we live in a digital age that we're all very aware of, but how often do we come home from work and we still have our work emails, or we have calls from our bosses or texts from our bosses? Or for young workers, we come home from work and your bosses text me, can you come in for a shift? I've had come in for a shift, like I've had that text message so many times, or can you start 2 hours earlier, like, and you can't switch off. And that is key for your mental health and for your for your health. You need to be able to switch off and relax and not have to take your work home with you. And I think that's an issue that young workers or workers in precarious employment definitely face. And I think employers need to take responsibility for that. And as well, on that point, what I would say in order to combat that is employers, I know it's a bit mad, but in order to tackle mental health, they need to offer their workers more stability. And one way of doing that is getting their workplaces unionised so that workers have a voice. And again, I know it's been said time and time again, but the Tories' despicable austerity measures and that mental health services have been cut up and down the country is nothing short of a disgrace. And again, that's something the government should be taking responsibility for.
Thank you very much, Maria. I think all the points that you have made there are excellent and really important, and looking at the impact that work and workplace policies or the lack of them have on people's mental health and well-being. We actually have very recently did an equality survey, and the main thing that has come out of that is workers' mental health and the lack of trust that they have in their employers to support them properly. So I suppose that there's a whole load of work that has to be done in this area of mental health, and it's something that affects all protected characteristics, as has been said, all workers and our older workers as well. Has anyone got any final comments on mental health? Because I know it's a big topic, just before we move on. Yep, Tony?
Just to say that, and I think Maria was just going to touch on it there. If you are a mental health first aid or mental health champion or whatever, don't forget your employer will know that, and your employer will then delegate their responsibility for the workers away, and they'll put it on your shoulders. And Davina's 100% right. I mean, union reps just now are at their absolute max. With everybody working from home, and try to emphasise the fact that plonking a laptop on a dining room table isn't a workstation, and the amount of work that you do when you're at home. I mean, you do far more at home than you would actually do when you're at work sometimes. So just to make sure the employer doesn't put all mental health issues to the shop stewards to deal with, or your union's good at this, they can deal with this. Our guys are really at their wits' end just now, and putting that amount of pressure back on them from the employer isn't the way we want to go.
Okay, thank you very much, Tony, and that's really important as well. I know that a lot of teachers sometimes are expected to, I suppose, pick up the gap, particularly for young people that are waiting on lengthy waiting lists. So, for example, you could have a young person that's getting no support for up to a year, and it's teachers that are very often some that maybe don't feel equipped to support their mental health, that is very often left to pick up the pieces in that area. So thanks very much. I think that was really good discussion on mental health, and definitely an area that we should be discussing beyond this fringe. I want to go just on, as there is a wee bit of education there, on a question that has been put in around the views on school closures and blended learning. Now, this has been a bit of a subject of debate. It was raised this morning as well in the Herald and things like that. And I would like to put to the panel what they think about the possibility of school closures. And Pam, who's asked the question, we're really interested in your views on that in blended learning. There's been EIS have raised that they would be willing to go to industrial action if need be. We know that schools have been considered not as a workplace, and from an equality perspective, we'd be interested to hear your views on that. So I go to Usman on this first.
Thank you, Erin. I hope you can all hear me okay. Yeah, school closures and the potential closure. So you may recall when we went down into what I call lockdown 1 back in March, and when we were coming out of it and we were hoping to be in this kind of recovery phase that then turned out to be, unfortunately, a short-term recovery phase. A lot of parents and young people in particular that I had been speaking to, and that I had also been feeding in remarks and questions through national organisations that represent parents and young people, was about how is it all going to work? Are there risk assessments, particularly for those that were from a BAME background or a background and they were just worried about how they were going to go back to school, how they had obviously missed quite a bit. Those that were going to be sitting exams, there was a bit of uncertainty. And I guess, since then, since March, action has been taken by Scottish Government, by organisations like the SQA, Education Scotland, to kind of get there. But I know on the ground that, for example, some local authorities are still struggling as to, is that tailored risk assessment being done, or do they know about it? I was contacted by a teacher in Edinburgh with this question a couple of weeks ago, and I referred them to colleagues in the EIS who has been since supporting them. But the local head teacher and local HR manager, it didn't dawn on them that they needed a tailored risk assessment done, and it's things like that. But some it's not just teachers; it's young people, it's parents who are also worried about these things. And it's we as STUC are feeding these things in. We're involved. The STUC Black Workers Committee is involved in the BMIS network that's been set up recently. But there is much more to be done, and we've got to take that learning from lockdown 1 into any future situations that we find ourselves in. But more than that, make sure that when we finally recover from this, we recover stronger and better.
Okay, thank you very much, Usman. So it's been expressed by many teachers that their safety and their health and health and safety has been essentially played as a kind of political tool, and that some teachers still don't feel safe. But as much as everybody would like schools to be open, what is the panel's views on this? So there's some comments coming through about teachers teachers' health and safety not being taken seriously as perhaps other workplaces. Tony?
I feel terrible about this. The way I think, if you close a school and you send a kid home, in this day and age, in the 20th century, to our shame, it'll still be the female that gives the primary care to the child. So you're taking people for the front line, because you can't go to their grannies and grandpas now. So nurses and cleaners and people who are predominantly female workers will be landed and have to give up their work and go home. And if they are the only breadwinner in their family, it is it's tragic because I understand exactly what the teachers are saying, especially the teachers that have to get close, the teaching assistants that have to get close to the kids rather than up at the chalkboard. It is a really prickly issue, and I'm betwixt and between. I'd like to support my EIS colleagues, but I think in these days that the people that will be pulled in to watch the kids will be the primary caregivers, which is scandalously discriminatory against women.
Okay, it's funny you say that, Tony, because just as you're speaking, there has been a comment that's come in around someone who is a single parent. They are a woman, and they've said that their heart sinks at the thought of school closures. They're very worried that. So I'd be interested to hear Davina's views on that in particular before we move on.
Yeah, I have to say I'm in a similar position. I am a single parent. I do work full time, and I experience the joy of trying to work from home and homeschool. I remember one meeting, I was in the middle of a joint negotiation meeting, and all they could hear was my son answering his maths questions in the background. They wondered why there were random numbers being shouted out, and it wasn't just a request for more money. So it is really difficult. I don't think there is an easy answer, and I wanted to share this one because I mentioned about the parent who has multiple children being in and out of self-isolation. So I did want to share this quote from her tweet. One of my kids got out of self-isolation yesterday, while another has been messaged this morning to isolate. All 3 of my school-age kids have now had to isolate. I want to cry. I know this is selfish, but it is a lot. And that's the problem we've got at the moment. It's different authorities are doing different things. They're being advised to self-isolate for different times. There's not that continuity or understanding. And throughout this, there's not a clear understanding of what's going to happen to the exam diet next year. And I think that a real equality impact, because a lot of the children who we are shielding can't come back to school because it's not safe for them. And just to talk about the workers in the classroom, we know the ones the most at risk are the classroom assistants, who are predominantly female and are low paid. And again, they've been asked to risk the most. I think we have to have a clear plan from the Scottish Government. I don't feel they learned a lesson from the last lockdown. They scrambled about, and we saw the fiasco that was the exams results, which predominantly affected those from working class backgrounds more than from the well off. And my real concern is we get to July and we go through this whole debacle again. So I think there has to be a clear message. We know there's issues for children sent home from school around mental health, about self-isolating. We know there's issues about digital poverty and actually being able to get online and access online classes. But we are continuing to play an experiment with our children's lives if we continue to insist the schools open at all costs. And I think there has to be that plan B. And I do think we have to look at it from a health and safety perspective. What we're asking our teachers to put up with, and it's not just teachers. If you look at the whole school environment, you're talking about classroom assistants, you're talking about cleaners, you're talking about janitorial staff. There's a wider environment that you're having an impact on. And my last point would be, as a parent, I check my emails, my private emails every afternoon, feel like expecting an email from the head teacher telling me this be yet another case. And I've had quite a lot of emails from him over this period of time, because as the cases are reported, we get told, well, it's the case in, for example, S6, and those parents who've got children who had close contact to that case have been notified separately. So it's not an easy answer, but I think we need to move. I think Wales have made the right decision about their decision on exams. We need to look at how we can support, because this is not going to end in December, even when the vaccines are available. We could be in and out of this kind of situation up until the next academic year as well. So unless we start to look at this as a longer term issue and focus on equalities and protect our workers in the schools, we are going to go around in this circle for an unlimited period of time. So I think there needs to be a Scottish Government direction on this, and if that means all Tier 4 schools shut down, so be it, but at least have a clear and consistent message for parents so we know where we're coming from.
Thank you very much, Davina, for that answer. And like you said, I don't think there's an easy answer to this, but just as you've said about consistency and continuity and a clear message, I think parents, teachers, everybody else would really appreciate that. So Thomas, just before we move on, did you want to come in?
Yeah, I'll be brief. As I'm not a parent, I work in higher education, like Tina, but as a technician rather than academic. And I do. If the EIS were to ballot, I would absolutely support them wholeheartedly if that's what the members chose to do. My worry is, I suppose, that what's never really said about teachers, lecturers, and I'll be honest, even as an openly queer person at work, I get young LGBT students come and, chat to me because they see somebody who's visible, who they can get that connection with. The amount of pastoral input that a lot of people, not just teachers, but throughout the whole school, give to these kids is huge, and it's really not spoken about an awful lot. Combine that with the fact that for every student that needs to go home and isolate, you then have the issues of what are the individual workplace policies of one or both parents, if it's a more than a single parent household. Some employers may be okay with allowing for working from home, others may not, and I've had to deal with cases with folk who are being told, no, you'll have to just use unpaid leave. So people are now having to face between, how do I look after my child if I can't if I'm not going to get paid for 2 weeks? What we need to be doing alongside any sort of campaigning around this is say that we need to make sure that all workplaces take as pragmatic approach as possible, but we don't keep using schools as a political football, because that's what we saw, particularly in Westminster, constant back and forth at the farcical theatre that is PMQs, constantly talking about school closures. We have to have both the parents, the children, and also the workers' interests at heart. There isn't going to be an easy solution, but you need to actually think these through very carefully and not just go for what will get the most headlines.
Okay, thank you very much, Thomas. So we are, I'm going to fit in 2 more questions just before we come to a close. So the question I'm going to ask is from Stuart Wakeley-Monroe, who's part of our LGBT Workers Committee and also a very prominent LGBT activist within the trade union movement. And Stuart has asked, what is the STUC going to do to hold the Scottish Government to account on the Gender Recognition Act and facilitate a dialogue on this? So this is something that has essentially been put on the back burner by the Scottish Government, which is of deep concern to many people. I'm going to come to Thomas on this. Firstly, just given that you are part of the LGBT committee, and if anyone else on the panel wants to come in, then just pop your hand up and I will come to you. So Thomas, if we can keep it brief, and then we will go to our final question of this evening.
Sure. I'll be as quick as I can with this. The whole dialogue over reforms to Gender Recognition Act have been blown hugely out of proportion by a press who are willfully misrepresenting the need for reform as somehow an attack on others. This is about trying to make life easier, or a tiny little bit easier, for some of the most marginalized people in the community. And some of the things that are being said against trans workers in this is the exact same rhetoric that we heard, 10, 20, 30 years ago against particularly gay men. It's the same things that were said about Black and minority ethnic groups earlier in the 20th century. It's the same divide and conquer thing over and over again. We need to absolutely hold the Scottish Government's feet to the fire over this in whatever, it needs to be a cross-party political campaign on this. And the fact that neither the Scottish nor British governments seem willing to do anything on it is frankly abhorrent. It's making the lives of my loved ones just a pain every time that they are the ones who have to take on the emotional labor to constantly reaffirm, no, they're not going to go and, you know, cause trouble from this. This is just about making life easier from an administrative perspective. Already, trans workers are having to spend years on a waiting list just to be even seen. It's not a sustainable system. It's causing a huge amount of mental ill health, and we absolutely need to do something about it as a union movement. Non-binary voices and trans voices are practically silent amongst the organised labour movement, and it makes it very difficult to see how we can move on from it. But all I've got to say is just try and be as loud as we possibly can, as tiring as it may be. Sorry,
Okay.
it's not fair. Yeah.
No, that's fine. Thank you, Thomas. Is there anyone else in the panel that wants to come in this question? Davina?
I think just to echo the fact that we do have to push the Scottish Government. They were starting off down the right route, and then a lot of headlines scared them and put them into a further consultation, which, you know, just extended the stress that I know our trans members have experienced on this. And I think there's a lot of myths out there, and I think the STUC, perhaps one of the roles is that sort of myth busting. I'm actually putting out a positive case of why we do need the Gender Recognition Act to be brought forward and actually pursued, because at the moment there's a lot of scare stories out there that have given a disproportionate amount of media time, and I think what we need to do is actually put out a positive case, and I think it has to be a cross-committee activity. It can't just be the LGBT plus workers committee that takes the lead. It's got to be across the whole of the STUC to show that actually an injustice to one, as we often say in the trade union, is an injustice to all. Without that joint approach, I think those screaming voices against it will be heard far too loud.
Okay, thank you, Davina. Just on that, just before I come to anyone else, do you think there's, and Thomas, feel free to come back on this as well, do you think there's a misunderstanding on what this aims to do? So, you know, you're talking about myths. Is there a misunderstanding? Has the debate, a lot of the debate on this has been taken online? Do you think that's dangerous? In the fact that a lot of the debate around the Gender Recognition Act has been predominantly online. What are the panel's views in terms of misunderstanding or the debate happening online?
I think. Also, Tony, if you want to go first, mate, you know, more Malcolm.
Tony, you come in then.
Yeah, it's just a statement rather than anything else. I think what we do need is and it's coming from all the equality strands, as you were saying, to back up. It should be a positive myth busting thing coming out to try to overpower the negative press that we're getting and all the stupid lies that are being told right, left, and centre, and all the scare tactics. We need a positive myth building joined up between all the equality strands exercise to go ahead.
Okay, brilliant. Thomas?
I think it's very important for us to always remember that Twitter is not real life, and that there's a lot of voices on there, particularly with a single name followed by several numbers, who don't post an awful lot of things, that seem to be very, very concerned about a lot of these. It's being amplified a lot more, but when you actually, at least in my experience, when I've gone and spoken to a lot of workers, it's not necessarily a case of everyone's, you know, picked a side and that's it, and it's a vicious battle. A lot of workers genuinely don't understand many trans and non-binary issues at all. It's not even a thing that all people are aware of, that they even have colleagues who are trans or gender non-conforming. So I think there's a lot that we could be doing. I totally agree that I guess a sort of myth-busting approach would be helpful. But certainly when I've tried to explain to individuals, the small changes that were actually being asked for, a lot of the response was like, oh, is that all? And I think that's one of the things that we need to, that there's a lot more that needs to be done for trans inclusivity, and hopefully one day legal recognition for non-binary people. We do exist. But I think it's more ignorance than malice a lot of the time, and it's very difficult to not get angry or upset about it when it affects you personally or it affects your loved ones personally. But knowing that we'd have the support of the trade union comrades behind us will make fighting that battle so much easier.
Okay, thank you very much. I'd like to go to our final question of this evening, and this is to all of you. So the Scottish Parliament elections are next May. And what is one thing, if you had the ear of all political leaders right now, what is one thing that you would want all political parties to include or advocate, or if they were elected, implement, relating to your protected characteristics? If you had one thing you could say to them, this is what you must implement if you get elected for your protected characteristic, what would it be? I know that's a big question. I'll go to Maria first. You've got the ears of the politicians. What are you going to ask them to do for young workers in May?
I mean, it's simple for young workers, end zero in our contracts and end temporary contracts. And also end wage disparities. And yeah, I could go on, but that would be the start.
Perfect. Usman, one thing all the politicians should advocate for your protected characteristic, one thing they should implement if they get elected?
For me, it's going to be embedding the understand first, act second approach in all that they do. A lot of the things that we've been talking about, a common theme is that we know what the problem is. We kind of know what needs to be done about it. We now need the action to make it happen, and to make sure it does happen. And when it doesn't happen, to call it out. And that requires a fresh approach. And that for me is understand first.
Thomas, what do you believe that all politicians next year should be considering in their policies and manifestos for LGBT people and workers?
Vastly improve and expand trans healthcare, recognise non-binary people, and just make our lives a little bit easier.
Davina, what do all political parties need to do for women and women workers in particular, do you think?
It'll be a random thing, but I think what they need to do is they have to ensure 50-50 representation at all levels of politics. We have a shocking lack of female councillors, but we need 50-50 at all levels, but also in all boards and all trusts, because I think if you have more women in powers of position, we'll actually start to tackle things like gender discrimination and sexual harassment in the workplace.
Tony, what if you had the ear of all the politicians, what's one thing that you would like them to do for disabled people and disabled workers in Scotland?
I would say don't kid on you've overlooked us. Don't kid on that when we bring it to your attention, you say, oh, we'll just give a wee reasonable adjustment. We are being deliberately ignored, and I would like them to understand that we'll not stand for it any longer.
Okay, well, I hope the politicians are listening. We will be having a hustings closer to the time, so I'm sure that will be very lively and interesting. Before I close, I just want to say thank you very much to all the panelists. It's been a great discussion. We could, as I said, we could have a conference, a whole week conference, discussing and debating all these important issues. To everybody that's participated in the comments or on social media, thanks for joining us on this Sunday, and hopefully this is not the last Fringe that you do join. Hopefully it's not the last webinar you join. And if you're passionate about equality, get involved, get active in your union. Email me if you want to get involved in the strands. We've got lots of opportunities for you. We need every single person on board to fight for equality. This has just been a flavour of some of the issues that we're facing in terms of equality. We are, as I said, going to be hosting a webinar on Disability History Month on the 3rd of December. We will also, we're also hosting a webinar during 16 Days of Action on domestic abuse and risk assessments, looking at the impact of evaluating risk assessments with home working and gender-based violence. So please come along to that. But again, thank you very much to all the amazing panelists and to everyone who has joined. It's been an honour to chair. So everybody take care and make sure that you also tune into our Congress on Tuesday. Thanks very much and have a good night.